So again, this is the second of the series of an ongoing sports file subset I'm doing on the greatest periods, playoff periods for the Montreal Canadiens in Stanley Cup history. Now, this probably ranks as one of the most important comfort behind victories in modern sports. I don't think anything really compares with it because you got to look at the opponents they had to come back against to do this. Of course, we're talking about which I think was the Stanley Cup decider that year, where Montreal defeated the Boston Bruins 7-5 in Game 2 of the quarterfinals at the Boston Garden. Now, Montreal wasn't given much hope to do well against Boston in the series because they failed to make the playoffs in 1970 and eventually lost Game 1 in less than impressive fashion. Now, Game 2 opened very interestingly with Ivan Cornway scoring a very key goal early that some felt showed the momentum that Montreal could have if they could stop Bobby Orr and some of the defensive defensemen in Boston on the power play on even strength. Now, what we didn't expect, Ken Dryden had a really bad first half of this game. He gave up five straight goals, which wasn't uncommon for somebody like Kenny Dryden to do that because straight out of university, he did know all the players well in the NHL. And you have to remember he only played a few regular season games before being called to replace Rogie Vachon as the team's number one goalie into the playoffs. Now Bobby Orr had a great first and second period in that contest with a goal and three assists. Because Bobby Orr, if you give him a chance to score goals, but when Henri Richard made the score 5-2 with less than 5 minutes left, because all these five straight goals were scored before the 10-minute mark in the second period. And I don't know if Boston lulled themselves to sleep, felt that five goals was enough. But when Henri Richard scored, he went into the dressing room at the end of the second period and allegedly said to everybody, we scored late. We scored early in the third period. We can come back against Boston. This is the greatest defensive team going. And Richard, who was probably the biggest money player other than Jacques Lemaire in the early 70s from Montreal, his prediction came true. Jean Beliveau, who I had the pleasure of meeting in 1980 at a Montreal Canadian event in Campbellton, New Brunswick, he probably played the biggest 2 minutes of his career early in the third period, scoring two quick goals in short succession, like within the slot, both from Cornway and Ferguson. When that line was on Cornway, Ferguson, and Beliveau, nobody could stop them. So here we have it's the 4:22 mark of the third period. Boston had 1 point led 5-1. It's 5-4. The announcers for Boston are getting concerned. The French announcers are getting excited. And a lot of people said if Jacques Lemaire is given an open chance, he's going to score the tie. And sure enough, just like his goal later on against Chicago in Game 7 over Esposito's shoulder, he scored probably second biggest goal of his career to tie it at 5-5, unassisted at the 10-minute mark. And pretty well from then on, we knew it was just a matter of time. 5 minutes later, Beliveau with his third point of the period, and Ferguson, probably one of his biggest clutch goals of his career. Remember, he was planning to retire after the regular season. Put Montreal ahead for good 6-5. And then Frank Mahovlich, who was kind of quiet for the whole game, scored a seventh goal for Montreal on a partial breakaway on a big slap shot winning the crease. Now, a lot of people believe that Bobby Orr was the cause of the collapse in Game 2. If you really look at the tape, he was on the ice for the majority of Montreal's goals in this game. Was he not 100%? Was he not really adapting to the Beliveau Ferguson line? We don't know. But all I know, Bobby Orr didn't play his best second and third period ever in that contest. But nobody was going to stop Montreal for some reason. Having Dryden in net, and Dryden made a lot of key saves, and that's now. Let's look at what happened. Boston could have easily won three straight cups if you would have bet Montreal in the series. So they stopped three straight cups for Boston, stopped the dynasty. He went on to beat Boston in 7 games, a mini miracle in Game 7, and nobody expected Montreal to beat Boston, let alone beat Boston with key wins at the Boston Garden. He went on to play the Stars, won 6 games against Minnesota, 7 games against Chicago, and Montreal basically took momentum of Game 2, the biggest comeback in NHL history and one of the biggest comebacks in sports history, because this would be comparable to the New York Yankees leading the Blue Jays 11-0 in a World Series game, and the Blue Jays winning 13-11 with 13 runs in the last 3 innings. You look at Boston history, you can win as many cups as possible, but it all comes down to this. They had an opportunity to put the nail in the coffin of the Montreal Canadiens to stop Montreal's dominance of them, and they blew it in their own rink of all things. Derek Sanderson said later on, "We blew it." Wayne Cashman, "We blew it." But what's kind of funny, ladies and gentlemen, the 1971 series between Montreal and Boston started a camaraderie between the Boston and Montreal players, which passed on to the 1972 Summit Series because Cashman, all these different players. Ferguson was a coach. Cornway played. Frank Mahovlich played. Bobby Orr was an injured player of the squad. Eddie Johnson, who played a terrible game as a backup in this game too, he was the number 3 goalie. So there's a lot of inside stories about the game, but a lot of people believe John Ferguson Beliveau was the last gasp. It's like the Lions are waking up and haven't caught a gazelle in months, and here on death's door, they killed 2 gazelles that feeds the whole pride. That's how important it was. And anybody that's born between 1962 and 1965 is old enough to remember this game and to remember the shock, the lack of noise in the Boston Garden, because Boston Garden has always been a noisy place. The lack of noise, the lack of, the incredulous feeling. How in the heck does an old bunch of creaky players? And Montreal didn't have the best team going. They had like Bobby Sheen and Roberto and, these marginal third and fourth liners. You weren't the best team in the world, all right? But, Boston should have won. Any team that has Esposito and Bobby Orr in the Boston Garden and can't beat the Montreal Canadiens team that's beatable, it's got to be a combination of factors. Dryden and Noel Men, the way it goes. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's COVID Tuesday. This is the second of a series we're doing on the greatest playoff periods in Montreal Canadiens history. We're going to be talking more about the 86 Cup run. I'm not sure which period we're going to talk about. The third period of Game 5 in Calgary in the finals, or maybe the overtime against Hartford in Game 7, even though it was not a full period. We'll leave you with that thought. But in the history of the Montreal Canadiens, usually when they have their best playoff period, they're either en route to the Final Four or the Stanley Cup. These great playoff periods allow the team to overachieve in a lot of ways. So again, stay safe. Happy Canada Day, everybody out there. And if you want to be Canadian for a day, tomorrow's the day to do it. Have a good day. Bye.